Good to go?
Absolutely.
Okay. Ryan, good as well? Okay, perfect. So it's 3 p.m. everyone, so let's get started. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here with us today on the strategies to promote wildlife control and reduce losses in ag systems webinar. So today we're gonna have two speakers. We're gonna get started with Dr. Cory Heaton. He's the Clemson State Wildlife Specialist. He is I don't know if this is the correct term, but a triple Clemson graduate. He did his BS, Master's, and PhD here in Clemson, and his research interests focus on balancing the interactions of wildlife and humans and trying to work with solutions for wildlife problems in agriculture operations. So this is what he's going to be discussing with us today, and really approaching concepts, strategies, and some of his experience and also the research findings to reduce wildlife damage in ag systems. So Cory, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Liliane. If y'all bear with me 1 minute, I'm going to try to pull this up without reading all of this. Technology is not my thing, but we'll see how it goes. All right. Can everybody see? We're all good?
We can, but it's not on presentation mode yet.
So to get there.
On the, I cannot see the bottom, but on the bottom of the PowerPoint, there should be like a, let's see, the little thing, the presentation on the bottom.
Not that one.
Next to the Zoom line.
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Excellent. All right. So let's jump into this thing and see how it goes. For those of you who have been in some of these programs I've done before, we've been working with different methods for reducing deer damage in row crops for about 10 years now. And one of the stuff that we've done on the row crop side is the same practices that'll work for y'all. And I'm going to spend most of my time today talking about those things, but I'm always around and always willing to answer questions and try to help you out. That's what we're here for at Extension. So I'm going to go through this and fill you in on what we're seeing and what we're looking at. But again, just remember, feel free to reach out. Happy to work with you on your personal problems with your ag operation, and we'll see what we can do. So anytime we're trying to manage a pest or a problem, it really comes down to whether or not you're successful is, do you actually understand the problem that you're trying to fix? And I think a lot of us struggle with that. I know I do. But in terms of deer, we really wanted to get a good understanding of what was going on with deer across the landscape. Why are we seeing high damage in some of these fields and no damage in other fields? And so in order to understand that, we really needed to get an idea of what that actual population of deer was looking like. So we came into a lot of South Carolina where we were very rural areas with a lot of agriculture on the landscape. And we set up spotlight survey routes, which is a method of counting deer and estimating density on the landscape. And we set these routes up to be very representative of everything that's going on in the landscape. So these routes are not just spotlighting, soybean fields. We are spotlighting soybean fields and peanut fields and cotton fields and vegetable fields. But we're also looking at pastures and haylands, and we look at everything that's typical of that landscape: churches, solar farms, cemeteries, housing areas. Anything you would find on that landscape, we've got that route set up so that we see it while we're spotlighting. And it's been real eye-opening to see how much that deer density varies, even in a small geographic area. And what you're looking at on that slide on the right-hand side of that slide, those are 3-night averages of the deer that we counted per square mile on each of those survey routes. And in that small area, you can see that we go from 125 deer per square mile on one survey route to maybe 5-7 miles down the road, we're at almost 300 deer per square mile. So in every county that we've done this work, that's exactly what we're seeing. So that deer population varies tremendously across the landscape. So that's why you see some fields have more damage than the other fields. That's one of the factors that are at play. It can be quite challenging though when we have deer that are able to pick up and move. And I don't think we give that enough consideration. There's nothing to limit where those deer go. And a good friend of mine and a client that is serious about managing deer, he does a really good job of watching these deer on camera. And one of the things that we found this year, some of these deer are picking up and walking 3 to 4 miles to feed every single day. So you may be dealing, if we're looking at this map, down where it says 278 deer per square mile, you may be pulling in deer from all the way up there at the top where it says 128 deer per square mile. But I have no doubt that you could be pulling deer from that section where it says 100. So you have a core group of deer that are living on that particular area. Let's call it a range. But that doesn't mean there aren't other deer moving into that range at times to feed. So that makes it really difficult to manage based on numbers. So that throws some kinks in the chain. Doesn't mean we can't do it, but I just want you to understand that it does vary tremendously across the landscape. So another part of understanding this problem is how much are we actually losing to these deer? What are they actually doing? And so we set up a study several years ago, and we have a PhD student that's working on this. But we came into a lot of these row crops. We work with soybeans, cotton, and peanut in a lot of different locations across the state. And we put exclusion cages in. And I realize that picture doesn't do a very good job of showing you the cage, but it's hard to take a picture of a small wire fence in the middle of the ag field. But there is a cage there. And that cage prevents deer from feeding inside of it. But everything else is the same. So inside that cage has the same fertility. It's had the same weed control. It's had the same planting. Everything's identical, except we have kept deer from being able to get in there to feed, right? And so across the field, what we did was we installed a cage and a check, and a cage and a check, so that we could estimate how much yield was walking out because of deer. And you know, we're not trying to find the worst case scenario to report. We're looking for a legitimate middle of the road, what is really going on out there. So we could have came in and put these cages right on the edges of these fields and made it look like the damage was a lot worse than it actually is across all of our acreage. But we didn't want to do that. We wanted to be accurate with our numbers. So we come a considerable ways off the edge. I think this year we were at 36 rows off the edge before you put a cage in. So we're moving out into that field a little bit. And then we go to the areas of the field where we would expect the damage to be the lowest. In this particular example, that was right along the road. So we take all those numbers and we average them together, and that gives us, you know, what we saw the yield loss in that field. And I feel like that's the best way that we can do this to have a fair estimate of what's going on. And it seems to be fairly accurate from what we've looked at. And I go through these pictures all the time, but when we started doing this work, I had no idea that the damage was as evenly distributed across these fields as it actually is. I'm used to riding by the field, and you can look on the edge of the field and you can see where the deer had really hammered soybeans on the edge of the field, you know. But as we go through these next few slides, I want you to take a look at this, and I want you to understand that just riding by the road, you would have never realized that the deer were causing a problem in this field. And I also want to point out while I'm here, and I'll show you some examples of yield loss in a minute, but keep in mind, this field is what I would consider to be mild to moderate damage. All right. So 2 WAP, that's weeks after planting. We came in, we have the cage established. If you look, you can see the shadow of that drone flying over us. We set these studies up. We don't walk back in that field again until it's time to harvest. I didn't want our presence having any impact on how deer use that field. We told the farmers to continue doing exactly what you always do and what you'd planned on doing. We didn't want to put extra human presence in that field. So we set it up so we can fly it with a drone and see what's happening. All right, so let's walk through this. 2 weeks after planting, you don't really notice any difference in that bean stand inside that cage versus outside that cage. At 3 weeks after planting, you can already see a difference. But look how uniform the damage is outside of that cage. You wouldn't have noticed that driving down the road. That whole field would have looked like that, and you'd have just thought that's the growth stage the beans were at. If we go to 4 weeks after planting, you can see a big difference in what's going on inside that cage versus the rest of that field where deer have the luxury of browsing. 5 weeks, we continue to see greater growth inside the cage versus outside the cage. 6 weeks, it's still very obvious that you have a lot of deer damage going on. It's also very obvious that that deer feeding injury is uniform across that field. By 8 weeks, the beans are starting to grow, starting to catch up. The deer pressure is decreasing in this field. And 10 weeks after planting, we still have taller beans inside that cage, and we still have greater row closure, canopy closure inside that cage. But just riding down the road, those beans look like they have caught up, right? So this is what I would call mild to moderate damage. The deer eventually slacked off feeding in this field, and the beans were able to make up for that feeding injury and start growing and catch up with the areas where they haven't had issues. So again, if you look at all the fields on this particular year of the study, the percent of soybean damage, and this is yield damage, but we range from 8% loss to 89% loss, with an average of right at 25% loss, and that's yield loss. So across all the fields in the study that year, we lost 25% of the soybeans that we should have had going into the combine. They walked off with deer, which is huge. That's a huge number. And I'm not going to get real big into economics in this study, but that was big. And so what does that look like in fields that aren't mild to moderate damage? So the picture that I just showed you is in the top right corner. That was the 10 weeks after planting. In the picture on the left, you're looking at the exact same growing point for a high damage area. And if you look in that bottom picture on the right, that picture was taken the same day. That's my ink pen beside those beans. They have finished doing all they're going to do. All they're waiting on now is maturing and for us to come harvest. They never made it to 6 inches tall outside of that cage. So in the picture at the top, the deer stopped and started feeding on something else, right? They were able to catch back up. They were able to put on a significant yield improvement. And that field probably wound up losing 8 to 15% of its yield potential because of deer. But this picture on the left, even though we made beans on those little short plants, it's impossible to get them in the combine. So it's 100% loss on that field. You're not harvesting anything. And we see this as we go across the state from field to field, location to location. And I'm sure as producers, y'all have seen the same thing on the forage side. Some of these fields get hit a lot harder than others. And some of these fields continue to be hit throughout the growing season. It's like they never leave. They stay on those fields the whole time. So that becomes a major problem for us. And another thing that I like to point out with this slide that I haven't got anywhere else in this talk, so I'll point it out while I'm here. If you look in that picture on the left, you see the soybeans that are obviously damaged. But if you look farther left in that picture, you'll notice there's a lot of cotton right there. So we planted 16 rows of beans beside 16 rows of cotton beside 16 rows of peanuts, just trying to gauge the damage and which preference we had there. Well, it's really obvious that they preferred soybeans over cotton in this scenario, which brings us to the concept of these buffer crops, if you will, or sacrificial crops. So there's a mindset out there that we can plant the perimeter of our fields in soybeans, and then we can come into the remainder of that field and plant cotton or whatever we were trying to go. And the idea is that the deer will key in on the soybeans and they will leave the other crops alone. Now, this isn't a replicated study, so I'm not telling you this is going to work, but I will tell you in this scenario, we had 16 rows of soybeans. I didn't lose a single leaf off a cotton plant in this field, not one. They never touched it. And even more interestingly, they were walking the cotton field every single day because I had volunteer soybeans that came up in it, and they ate every single volunteer soybean that came up in that cotton without touching one leaf of that cotton. Deer love cotton. They eat a lot of cotton. We have as much or more damage in cotton as any other crop. But when they had soybeans right there readily available, they definitely keyed in and they definitely focused their feeding in this situation at this location on the beans. So there may be something to it where we're able to plant a sacrificial crop and keep them out of the crop we're trying to grow.
Cory,
Yes,
had a question that popped up. Did the deer stop grazing that soybean field, or did the growth just outpace what the deer were taking? Or do we have any way of knowing that? That's kind of what the question was.
Based on being in that field, they stopped feeding on this field. In other scenarios, I have seen the damage, do exactly what we saw here just because of, but deer pressure still had to be reduced in order for it to catch up. When you've got 10 or 12 deer feeding at any given time, they can keep up with that growth. And in some of these situations, we're looking at these fields, 100+ deer standing in that field at one time. So the plant just doesn't have the potential to outgrow that level of feeding. And that's fairly representative of what you see in that picture on the left. Those plants were trying to grow as hard as they could. They were exhausting every resource they had, and they just couldn't keep up with the level of browsing that was going on. So let's talk about managing some of this. We got an idea of the damage that's going on, and I realize that was all row crops, and this is predominantly forage folks, but it's the same thing you're dealing with. The first thing I want to point out, we're going to have to do this in an integrated pest management strategy because there's not a single management tool alone that will stop 100% of this damage. I read a paper the other day in Farm Progress article that said repellents don't work. It's a complete waste of money. Being perfectly honest with you, based on the ones he tested, I've also tested them. You'll see them in this presentation in a minute. I can't say that I disagree with him, but we have to make our minds accept something. The products being tested may or may not be very effective, but that doesn't mean there aren't effective products out there. But you also have to understand that no management technique for agriculture pests is 100% effective. You don't go spray the weeds in your pasture and kill 100% of them. You don't go spray armyworms and kill 100% of them. There will always be some that escape any of these pesticide applications we make, and the same thing holds true for these deer repellents. There's always going to be some that penetrate through where you've sprayed repellents. There's always going to be that case. So we're not shooting for 100%, even though that'd be great. We're shooting for reducing that damage to a tolerable level, right? So we're going to have to incorporate several things. There's a ton of information out there about how valuable integrated pest management is and how it's the most effective method, regardless of the pest we're dealing with. So by incorporating several techniques, we're going to be far more effective. All right. Now, having said that, there is one management technique that is key to all other techniques working, and that is managing the herd density. If we don't manage herd density correctly, I agree with what the young man said in his paper. We are wasting our money on any other technique. That has to happen first. Until you get that herd in check, none of these other methods are going to do a whole lot of good, right? And we'll spend more time talking about that. Repellent programs. Been working with repellents for a long time. I'm going to show you a lot of data we've collected on that. Repellents can and do work. There's limitations to what they can do, obviously. And I will be the first to tell you, if you've got over 100 deer per square mile, which most of our ag areas do, there are significant limitations on what those repellents are actually capable of. Fencing is the same thing. unless you put up one of these very expensive high tensile woven wire fences that it's 8 foot tall and virtually train proof, deer can and will get in there. The higher that deer density is, the more likely they are to get in there. So step one, we have to manage that herd. And let's talk about that a good bit. You can't manage that herd without knowing what the herd actually is. So I recommend that all of you, if you have never done a deer spotlight survey, there's a lot of information on how to do it online, and I'd be happy to get it to you if you can't find it yourself. But set up a survey route that's representative of your farm in that area, and let's get a good estimate of how many deer are on that property or in that region. All right, and we need to do 3 nights of this. All right, and take the average of those 3 nights. I would highly recommend that you consider doing 2 surveys a year. It's very difficult to do it during the growing season because vegetation's tall and it's not easy to see them. But if you do it year in, year out, you can develop trends based on what you're seeing at that time. The ideal time to do deer surveys is in January. During January, we're starting to run out of food resources. We have cool temperatures. Deer are biologically forced to get up and move. And it's easier to count deer that are up and moving around. And it gives us a better, I think, a better estimate of what's actually on the landscape. So January season, be out there, do a spotlight survey. If you're able, come back and do another one in August. But get an understanding of how many deer you're actually dealing with. So once we have an idea of how many deer are out there, there's some things that we have to take into consideration. Harvesting is extremely critical to making any of this work. And if we look at the National Deer Association's information on whitetail deer, they suggest that we need to harvest 20 to 30% of our adult does to stabilize that herd. And that's annually. So if you have 10 adult does in that field, 2 to 3 of those does have to be removed each year just to keep that population stable, not to decrease it, to keep it stable. So if we want to decrease that population, you're going to have to remove more than 30% of the adult does to do that, right? And that's doesn't seem like a lot when we're talking about 10 deer, but when we start talking 150 deer per square mile, that becomes a whole nother thing. And also, if you look in the literature, deer densities 20 to 30 per square mile seems to be the best number. If you can stay at that range or lower, you can manage the deer damage that you're going to experience. But if we start getting higher than 30 deer per square mile, we're going to have damage that we may or may not be able to stop with any of the techniques I'm talking about today. As we get up to 100 or 150 deer per square mile, we're really going to struggle to do that. And to put this in perspective for you, deer per square mile, how does that work out to the landscape? So at 20 deer per square mile, we're talking about a scenario where we have 32 acres available for each deer. And at 30 deer per square mile, we have 21 acres available for each deer. But if you'll look, when we start getting up to 100 deer per square mile, you have a little bit over 6 acres available per deer. And at 150, you have 4 acres available per deer. When we get to this level, we see very high damage in agriculture. We see very high damage in our native plant communities in the surrounding areas. Forage availability, whether we planted it or it naturally came up, suffers tremendously when we have a deer herd 100 plus per square mile. There is simply not enough forage available to support that herd. And you know, it throws in other factors for the deer's health as well. When you crowd them in that close, one of the main things that's in habitat that we don't think about is space. Well, when you crowd deer down so that there's only 4 or 5 or 6 acres per deer, you have really crowded that animal in, and he's in a stressful environment because he doesn't have sufficient space. And there's some other things we need to talk about when we're on this slide. I hear folks a lot, well, we're going to go out there this year and we're going to wipe them out, and that should fix things for us. That's not how it works. This deer cull, if you will, is a perpetual thing that's going to happen every single year. It's not a once and done scenario. You're constantly going to have to go every year and reduce that deer population. So I realize this is kind of a confusing figure, and I can't even remember where I stole this from, but it does a pretty good job of representing what we see with deer. So the goal, obviously, is to keep them well below carry capacity. But in order to do that, we have to harvest a lot of female deer. All right. Well, what happens with white-tailed deer when you have a high female harvest? You see them rebound quickly because fertility goes up. More of your does are going to have fawns. Not only that, most of them will have 2 fawns. And it's no longer a 50-50 split on fawns being buck to doe. When we have high doe harvest, fertility goes up, the number of fawns hitting the ground goes up, and the number of female fawns born goes up. So evolutionary, somehow they have developed a mechanism that allows them to rebound very swiftly. So it's not going to be a 1-year deal. You're going to deal with this, maybe not as extreme every year, but you're going to have to deal with this year in, year out from here on out. But the big thing I want to point out is in that bottom picture there, and I'm going to show you more about this in a minute, but we have got to get away from the buck hunting mindset and focus on managing a deer herd. If you want to bucks, the number one way to do that is to reduce the deer population on the landscape, predominantly the females. We have to have high female harvest year in, year out if we're going to grow nice deer and if we're going to be able to farm. That's just it. That's the only way to do it. I know we have the most liberal hunting season in the United States. South Carolina has a season, depending on what part of the state you live in, that runs from August 15th all the way to January 1st. And I do know that a couple of the game zones don't open until September or October, depending on where you're at. But even then, we still have a very big hunting season. If you aren't able, and I realize a lot of folks aren't, a lot of folks are farming rented land and they have no control over that. Trust me, I understand. I've been through every scenario you can go through on this. But if you're in a situation where hunting is not taking out enough of those deer to meet your management goals, then depredation permits are available to help you with that. The Department of Natural Resources issues those permits. My understanding is this year it's been relatively simple to get those permits. If you had a legitimate problem, they work with you to get the tags for the most part. So that's a good thing. The downside of that is that's a lot of extra work put on a farmer to have to go out at night and harvest deer. I'm not wishing that on any of you either. I'm just telling you that it is available, and this may be the difference between putting money in the bank at the end of the year and not putting money in the bank. So keep that in mind. If the regular hunting season's not meeting the needs, and that's where it should happen. You know, we shouldn't have to shoot. I got in trouble for saying this, but I'm going to make sure I say it again and make sure people understand it. If deer hunting was doing its job, there would be no reason that we had to use depredation permits. If we harvested every deer that was issued a tag last year in South Carolina, there wouldn't be a deer left in South Carolina. More tags were issued than we have deer. We didn't even fill half the tags that were issued last year. So if deer hunting would do its job and take deer off the landscape, we wouldn't have to shoot deer during the summertime, during the growing season. But that's not happening. So if it's not happening on your property, call DNR, get them to come out and issue depredation permits to meet your management goals for your farm. SCDNR puts out a harvest report every year. Charles and Jay do a good job of collecting all the data and assembling it into a harvest report, and it's usually available pretty early in the year every year. By the end of January or February, we usually have a publication out that tells us what went on with the deer herd in South Carolina during the previous hunting season. All right, so what happened last year? In 2023, in South Carolina, we harvested 104,000 bucks and 93,000 does. That doesn't match anything I just said, right? We killed more bucks than we did does. That has been every single hunting season since they started keeping records in South Carolina. We do it wrong, and we do it wrong every single year. Bucks, how many phones do bucks have? Bucks don't have phones. If we are going to control this herd and make it where we can farm and make it where we have the healthiest, greatest potential for the deer herd, we have got to harvest more does than bucks. So this 198,000 total deer that were moved last year is actually a 10% increase from the reported harvest in 2022. And it is still a lot lower. It's still almost 40% lower than the record harvest back in 2002, which was like 320,000 animals. We harvest a lot of deer in this state, but we don't harvest enough deer, and we're definitely not harvesting it in the right ratio of bucks to does. In 2023, our estimated deer population was 725,000. So based on the numbers that were harvested, we only harvested 26% of the total herd, which sounds like that's okay. We harvested a fourth of the herd, but does only represented 47% of that harvest. So we were way under where we should have been on that doe harvest. Even to stabilize, we were below where we should have been at to stabilize at that rate. That causes problems, and it allows the deer herd to get out of control real fast, real fast. But we have the opportunity to fix that. And the way it can be done is relatively simple. I do realize what it takes to harvest deer. I do realize what it costs to have deer processed. I do realize all these things. But I am telling you that if you do it and you do it right, it works. And Clemson's Research Center in Blackville at Edisto Rec is a perfect example of that. Edisto Rec's really representative of what's going on in that area. You know, it's a roughly 2,500 acre property. Significant portion of it is forested. There's a significant portion of it that's in livestock acres, whether that's pastures or hay fields. And there's a big chunk of it that's in agriculture, agronomy, row crop farming. Very representative of what you would see in that portion of Barnwell County. We have a great manager there who oversees the deer hunts, and he wants, you know, he wants to see that we have reduced deer damage and we're not experiencing crop loss there, because crop loss in research isn't tolerable. The other side of that is he wants to grow big bucks, and they harvest big bucks at Edisto Rec every year. How do we do it? We have taken advantage of depredation shooting when we had to, but we primarily manage that deer herd through annual hunting. And if you look at that figure on the left, we keep that herd at Edisto somewhere around 30 deer per square mile. And remember, I told you earlier, at 30 deer per square mile, we can manage deer damage. Well, I don't have trials at Edisto Rec. The reason I don't have trials at Edisto Rec is there's only 1 or 2 spots on the whole property where I would consistently have deer feeding injury to look at. Keeping that deer herd at 30 deer per square mile reduces the damage to the point that it's barely noticeable in the grand scheme of things. So you can get that herd down to that density, but you have to do it through your annual hunting. And in this scenario, this is looking at a couple-year average, but at Edisto Research Center, we harvest 51 deer most years, 50 to 51 deer most years. And of that, almost 40 of them are going to be female. So we have an extremely high female harvest. 70% of our harvest is female. 70%. That's big. That's how you make this work. And we're harvesting almost 50% of that herd every year when you add the bucks and does together. So we're removing half of the deer that are on the ground every year through annual hunting. And because we're doing that, we're not having to take advantage of that depredation permit process that's out there. If you look in that slide, we got depredation tags in 2013 and we got tags in 2018, 5 years apart. That's not every year. We're not having to go out and do this every single year. Most years we are able to do this by having a regular hunting season that is managed right, where you harvest more does than bucks and you harvest a big chunk of that population. it can be done. It's being done, and it works very well. But like I said earlier, there are different stipulations as we move across this state. You can't control what happens on a lot of this rented land. You can't control what happens on a lot of these family-owned properties. I get it. I get it. But I also get that this works. Not only does it work, it's a best case scenario for the hunter. You know, most of the kickbacks we get come from the hunters. I haven't heard anyone at Edisto that hunts there complain about the hunting experience, nor the quality of the whitetails that are on that property. You will have bigger deer, healthier deer, good chance of killing trophy deer. When you reduce that density, they have plenty of space and they have all the other resources that they need to fulfill their lives. So keeping that deer herd low is the best for the farmer. It's the best for your crop. It's the best for the deer, and it's the best for the deer hunter. Keep that density low.
Cory had another question.
Yes, sir.
I think they're trying to get you in trouble.
Okay.
Do you have any idea why more bucks than does are being harvested, especially when we know the other way around would be more beneficial?
Well, because deer hunters want to kill a buck. They want to kill a buck. And let's be honest about this. You know, honesty is my business. That's what I do. You can love me or hate me. I don't care. I'm going to tell you the way I see it. It costs a lot of money for folks to have deer processed. Now, I don't truly understand the burden of that because I've never had a deer process somewhere. I do all of them myself, and it doesn't cost me anything except my back and a little bit on the electricity bill. But if they're having to pay $100, $125, $150 per deer to have it processed, whatever it costs now, that adds up pretty quick. And for a lot of folks, that limits them to only being able to harvest 1 or 2 deer per season. All right. Well, if you're only harvesting 1 or 2 deer per season, you shouldn't shoot a buck, but I guarantee you that's what they're going to shoot. There's something about antlers that deer hunters just can't resist, you know, and that really drives it. That really drives it. I can tell you a million ways to fix that, but I can assure you that none of them would ever become law and none of them would ever happen. On a lot of the private properties I work with, where we're trying to manage for trophy deer and keep that population low, you're not allowed to harvest bucks until you've harvested all the does that are required on that property. We have a tag system in South Carolina. It'd be pretty easy to go with that. You know, if we're going to give you 5 doe tags and 2 buck tags, you don't get those buck tags until you've checked in those 5 does. That'd be a really simple way to make this work. But I also know that it will never make it through legislators. That'll never happen. So yes, you're right. We are doing it backwards. Yes, I'm aware we're doing it backwards, but no, I don't have the solution on how we fix that. On private properties, I do, where you can control it. It's pretty easy to control there. But as a whole, it's not. Hopefully that somewhat addressed that question. Moving along into this thing though, forage availability is one that I get thrown at me a lot. If we did a better job of managing the habitat around us, the deer wouldn't be feeding on our crops as bad. And in theory, I agree with you. If we did a good job of burning all these pine lands that are out there, if we did a good job of daylighting the roads on every property and we were promoting native vegetation to the best of our abilities, we could reduce the deer damage. Well, not so much. In my experience, some of the greatest deer damage that we see is in areas where the native plant communities are being managed the best. The worst case scenario for a farmer is to go try to farm beside a quail plantation that's doing a good job. If we've got good quail woods out there and that understory of those trees is burned regularly and we got a good distribution of forbs and legumes and native grasses growing out there, we create excellent habitat for white-tailed deer. Habitat that could feed white-tailed deer, a lot of them. But what we wind up seeing is you create a higher deer density because you've created better habitat, and then ultimately they overflow into those ag fields. So I'm not sold that improving the native forage availability reduces our risk as farmers for growing a crop. That's not what I've seen in my experience. I know there's a lot of discussion out there on that right now, but for me, it doesn't hold true in South Carolina in the places where I've looked at it. You know, that's not to say it's for a whole and for everywhere, but where I've worked and the biologists that I work with will all tell you where we have quail plantations doing a really good job of managing native plant communities and natural native forage, we have the highest deer injury in the row crops. So take it for what it is, but I'm not convinced that improving forage availability in our woods helps with this problem. Repellents. We got a long history of working with repellents, going way back. When I first started doing this, we just asked, Jeremy Green and I were working on this, and we just asked the farmers, you know, what do you think's working? What do you want us to look at? And so we started out, if you look at that list on the left, we started out with as many insecticides as we did repellents, because there was a lot of farmers who felt like when I sprayed acephate, my damage went down, or you know, when I sprayed Lore's Band, my damage went down. So we put them in trials, replicated trials, and looked at them. And those damage ratings that you're looking at, I do all the damage ratings on a 0 to 5 scale, where 0 is no damage and 5 is 100% loss of foliage. So they have completely stripped the foliage. What we found early on is that some of those soap bait products really worked. Des-Ex insecticidal soap looked really good when we first started doing this. Hinder's also a soap-based product that looked pretty good in the beginnings. We had good luck with everything. I mean, initially. What I've seen though is over time, I don't know if it's completely density dependent, like you just have so many mouths out there that they're going to eat anyway, or if they just get accustomed to it. But I haven't seen continued effectiveness of the same product over a long term. So repeated use of the same product, they eventually start feeding in there. We also did some work early on looking at in-furrow applications. And this kind of came from my experience with cotton. When I was a kid, deer didn't eat cotton, but we put Timic on just about every acre of cotton in this state back then. It went in furrow everywhere. So we looked at it. We looked at what happens if you put Timic in furrow, and we looked at Thimet, which is 4-8. So Aldacarbs used to be Timic, now it's AgLogic. They changed it. But what we saw where we used AgLogic or Timic, which is the active ingredient Aldacarb, we virtually stopped feeding injury in those fields. And if you look, it's kind of interesting where we used Thimet or 4-8, it was higher there than it was in the control. Like we almost attracted them to that section of the field. So that was kind of interesting to see. And we saw that again. This is replicated trials, more than one location. But one of the reasons we did not see damage in cotton when I was growing up and early in my career is because we were still putting Timic in the ground. And if all the stars align and you have the right amount of moisture, it does a really good job of preventing deer from feeding on that crop. So we look at a lot of other repellents along the way. You know, these DPs are Deer Pro. It's available on the market still. Hinder, of course, is a potassium salt, a soap of potassium salts. The soap that you see listed there is Des-Ex insecticidal soap. One of the things I think is really interesting when you look at this, the timeline of effectiveness. So after these applications, it looks like we have 2 to 4 weeks where we're able to reduce that deer damage. But by week 4, 5, 6, that damage is skyrocketing. So we don't get season-long control out of these applications. And I hear that from a lot of folks. Well, the repellent didn't work. I sprayed it and it got them out of there, but 2 weeks later, they were right back. Yeah, that's how it works, unfortunately. We got to start thinking about this stuff in dollars and cents. If I can put it out there right now for $10 in a soybean field, if I can put it out for $10 an acre in a soybean field, it's only got to make me 1 bushel of soybeans to pay for itself. If it makes 2 bushels of soybeans, it put money in the bank. So I get that it's expensive, but we got to sit down with the calculator and do the math on how much we're losing versus what it's going to cost to do this. And if I can put it out for less than $10 an acre, I'd almost bet you it's going to be able to pay for itself, even if you have to put it out 5 or 6 times. So that's that. A lot of these newer products we're looking at, $20 an acre for most of them, maybe a little bit more than $20 an acre. But at $20 an acre, each one of those applications I make has to put 2 bushels of soybeans back in my bank for it to make sense. Most of the time, we're seeing a lot more than 2 bushel return. So yes, it is frustrating that they come back and they start feeding, but no, it's not fair to say that they don't work. There are time limitations to how long they'll work. The other side of that too, rainfall plays in with a lot of these products. How long is it going to hold up after an inch of rain? You better be out there the next day if they're feeding in it, because it will wash a lot of these products off and they'll go right back to feeding on them. But the general thing I wanted you to understand is none of these products that I've tested are season long. You're just not going to get season long control out of any of these products. Realistically, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, I think is fair to say, and this data right in front of you supports that also. So just keep that in mind. It's not a once and done. You're going to be out there more than once with a repellent. Another study we did looking at aldicarb, and we looked at different rates of aldicarb. We basically took the planter and the boxes. We had an 8-row planter. We calibrated 4 rows for 5 pounds and 4 rows for 3 pounds. And we'd go across the field and put that out. So we were planting 4 rows with 5 pounds of aldicarb, 4 rows of 3 pounds of aldicarb. We got to the end of the field, we turn the boxes off, we turn around, and we plant 8 rows of nothing all the way across a 25-acre field. So what we saw was that damage, as soon as that field had sufficient moisture for those seedlings to take up aldicarb, damage stopped completely, as in not another leaf was removed. Before we had enough moisture for the plants to take up AgLogic, we had some damage, but we were borderline too dry to plant when we planted, followed by about 2 weeks without rain. We had germination with no soil moisture. How that happened, I don't know, but you can't take up AgLogic if you don't have soil moisture. And so you will see damage in that scenario. But once we were able to put it in the plant, it worked flawlessly, to the point that even the untreated control didn't have damage, very low damage. So it didn't matter in this study whether we put the 3-pound rate or the 5-pound rate. It worked the same, and it did work. It stopped deer feeding injury in that field. We've looked at it in combination with other repellents and insecticides to see what it does over time. If you look, Timic is what I keep referring to as aldicarb. If you look at those purple lines all the way across this study, anything we did and we had Timic in furrow worked extremely well. And that 0.5 rating that you see there for all those purple lines or less means that less than 10% of the foliage had been removed by deer, right? 10% foliage removal is going to have minimal, if any, impact on the yield of that crop. It'll be really low. So it worked great. If we didn't put anything in that box at planting, it didn't matter which product we added to it, the damage was still higher than where we used Timic. And we did the same thing with Thimet. And with Thimet, it was kind of up and down, but Thimet, in my opinion, didn't do a really good job. In fact, if we just use it alone, the damage in every study I've done with it, if we just use Thimet, the damage was higher than the untreated control in every study we've done. It's like they selected out and targeted those. And I don't know why. Maybe it's a chemistry thing within the plant. But what I can tell you is AgLogic does a really good job of preventing deer damage when we have sufficient moisture for us to take up that product, and we don't have so much water that we flush it out of the system. It's highly water soluble. It will flush out of that system if we get a lot of rain. So all the stars have to align to see how great it is. I understand that. But when the stars do align, it works extremely well. Last year, we looked at a big range of deer repellents in cotton. And if you look at the bottom, you can see all the products we tested, Bobex, Deer Out, Desex, Hinder, Penergetic, Plant Skid. We had a lot of products in this study. And I think the take home for me is if you look at week 1, when we went in to make the initial application, that was the highest damage we recorded across, and this is all study sites. I think this is 6 different counties worth, all compiled into one graph. But if we look at all of them across the board, damage was the highest before we made the application. And following that application, damage never made it all the way back to pre-treatment levels. So it's not easy for me to sit here and tell you that they didn't work. Now, the other side of this, statistically, there's no difference in any of these treatments. Statistically, they all work exactly the same. But looking at the graph, you can see that we had at least 4 weeks after that application where we managed to keep that damage down to an acceptable level before off again. All right. So if we had the opportunity to come back in and retreat, in that scenario, what I would suggest is you rotate to a different product than what you've used previously. You make that application, and let's keep our fingers crossed, and we may get 4 more weeks out of that. And if, depending on which crop you're growing, we may have to make that 3rd application. At that time, I'd probably rotate back to the first product I used that year, or purchase an entirely different product. So I had 3 chemistries to throw at them. But you're going to have to make more than one application. Statistically, I can't tell you there's any difference in those products. But it is what it is. They're not perfect. You're still going to have some browsing. As indicated here, there is not a single one of these that shows 0 browsing. There was some damage in every one of these plots. Did a similar study in some soybeans in Earhart last year. We only looked at a few products in that one, Desex, Hinder, and Penergetic. Week 0, when we came into this field, damage was really high. We made an application after rating that field. You can see that damage has gone down slightly at week 1, but 2 weeks after that application and 3 weeks after that application, we saw significantly reduced damage in that field. And it would be at that point, at the end of week 3 there, where if I was managing this farm myself, that's when I would have came back in and made an additional application. And it's easy to determine when you need to do that. Ride around that field and see every day or every other day and pay attention to when the browsing starts. And as soon as you see them start browsing again, apply the product again. And I realize that means multiple trips across the field. I get it. But it's either multiple trips across the field or don't bother going back in the field. In a lot of these scenarios, the damage is so bad. But 2 to 4 weeks, depending on the product you're using, that's the best case scenario. Doing a project this year with a very good product that I've been really impressed with. We started the year out by looking at some rates, and I'll show you the data from that in a minute. But this is a HM2123. It's a product that's going to be available from Helena. It looked really promising this year. We had the initial study to look at those rates, and now I've got another trial going where we're looking at the timing of applying this product, how often to apply it, and what rates we're putting out. And I don't have the data from that yet, but it is a very promising product. I'm really happy with what I'm seeing out of that one. It gives me hope that we may be able to get a little bit further than 2 to 4 weeks out of applications. So initially, we were testing it for the rates. And if you look at those figures, we tested 1 quart all the way up to 1 gallon of product per acre. And statistically, there's no difference in any of those rates. So if there's no difference in any of those rates, there's no point in me running a gallon per acre if I can do the same thing with a quart per acre. So that's huge. That saves the farmer a lot of money by backing it up. And from what I'm being told, at 32 ounces, we're going to be looking somewhere around $20 an acre cost for that product. But if you look at all those figures, we made it all the way to week 6 before damage really started becoming an issue. And again, look at the scale on the side, with 0 being 0 damage and 5 being 100% crop loss, all the way out to week 8. We still haven't made it to 50% foliage loss. So we're in a very high pressure scenario there. That's one of the best places I have to test deer feeding injury, because the damage levels are just off the charts at this place. But we had a solid 4 weeks to 6 weeks where the damage was minimal. So this is one of the longest lasting products I've looked at thus far. Really happy with what I'm seeing out of that. Have another study going this year looking at a product that's on the market. It's called X-Fence. I may get this wrong, but I think Ag Explorer is the company that yeah, actually it says on the label. Ag Explorer is the company that represents X-Fence. They had a few questions. Does it really work? How long does it last? What's your return on investment looking like? So we started out with the quart rate that they recommended, and I have no problem telling you that it worked fabulously. At a quart, it does a very good job. How long did it last? That has depended. Initially, I was getting about 2 to 3 weeks out of an application. The last applications are getting close to a month now, and they're still holding on. So feeding pressure obviously has changed in that stand. I'd say that's because of the presence of this repellent. And return on investment, you're looking at a product that's roughly $20 an acre. So with soybeans this year, every time I spray this product, it's got to put 2 more bushels of beans in that combine to pay for itself. Well, at 4 applications, let me show you this. I've used this a couple times the past few weeks talking about this. If you'll notice that white building that you can see, look in the picture on the right, and if you look in that upper left-hand corner of the picture on the right, you see that white building? This is the same field, the same end of the field, the same section that I showed you the images of earlier, where I had my ink pen sticking beside the soybean plants. This was 100% loss last year with no repellents. 100% loss. Now I've spent $80 in applications, and look at the beans that I have in there this year on the left. Those repellents are the reason those beans are there. Had I not made those 4 applications, it would look just like the picture on the right. No doubt in my mind. It pays for itself. It's more than going to pay for itself. At $80, I had to put 8 bushels of beans in that combine. Well, if I was only going to harvest 0 bushels, if I come over to this field, and obviously we haven't harvested yet, but just walking through it and estimating, if things continue the way they are, I'm going to have 50 plus bushel beans in that field. 50 bushel beans by far pays for all 4 of those applications. It would have paid for 10 applications. It would have paid for a lot more than 10 applications. So yes, it is an expense. Yes, it deducts from what your end of the day take home is. But do you want to spend some money and make a crop, or do you want to look at dirt all year? It's up to you. I mean, and there's nothing else I can tell you about this. It is expensive. Nobody wants to do it, but it is working. Take it for what it is, but it definitely paid for itself. More than paid for itself. We're doing a lot of work looking at different fences this year, and I know Brian's going to talk to you a lot about fences. I'm just going to spend a little time showing you some of the designs that are out there. There's several different models of electric fence. There's quite a few different versions of woven fences now, including some lower priced plastic versions. I haven't tested those yet, but they're on the market now. But I'll show you some of the ones that we're working with. The concept of those 2 bottom pictures is that they interfere with a deer's depth perception and discourage them from using the field. Let's get into the next slide, and we'll talk a little more about that. So we have set up a full surveillance system around 4 fences that we've constructed. We built an offset fence. We built a slanted fence. We built a high tensile woven wire fence. And I built a fence out of fishing line, and we'll look at all those. But we set up cameras so that there's no way for a deer to interact with any of those fences without being on camera. So I can judge anything they're doing when they get there. And the goal behind that is to help me identify the weaknesses of these fences and try to build a better fence, that one, that a farmer can afford to put up, and two, that actually works. But this offset fence is a fairly effective fence. I know it's been used for a very long time, from a hunting world where I come from. We use them on dove fields. They've been used on dove fields for a very long time. It's a 3-strand fence. All of them are hot or positive, whatever you want to call it. On that outside fence, you have 2 strands, one 15 inches above the ground, one 45 inches above the ground. And then we go 3 foot in and we put up a second fence, and it has 1 strand that's 30 inches. And it's relatively inexpensive fence to build. You're talking 3 strands of wire and the insulators, and you're 50 foot between posts. That's a relatively inexpensive fence to build. It's not free. Now, I'm not going to use the word cheap because nothing to do with building fence is cheap anymore. But the big take home here, this fence, we had 745 deer interactions on camera with them either standing beside that fence trying to identify how to get in or actually getting in. We had deer standing in this fence within 24 hours of completion. And so far from May till August, and I haven't made it past August's camera work yet, but from May to August, I already had 297 deer enter into that fence. But if you look, it has done a very good job of reducing damage. They don't spend a lot of time in that fence once they get in there. The browsing that has taken place has been minimal, and the plants are setting a really nice crop of beans. So deer do get in it, but it's still better than not having a fence, far better than not having a fence. The 7-wire slanted fence, this was one that I really like the idea behind it and the concept. It's built at an angle. It messes with their depth perception. What I really like about it is we alternate hot and ground, so we're getting a good connection and they get to feel the electricity when they touch it. It works. The total height of this fence is 5 foot. We're about 10 inches above the ground on that first wire, and then we space them out a foot for the rest of them. You can go 90 foot between posts. We use like a batten or a stay every 30 foot. Seems to hold everything in place pretty well. This fence has had more interaction than virtually the rest of the study combined. We've had 4,208 deer interactions with that fence from May till August. But we've had 300 deer get into that fence. So the deer are making their way into that fence. But if you look at it, that's a pretty healthy crop of beans. It has greatly reduced the damage that we're seeing. And I know you can't tell very well from that picture, but if you look to the left of that fence, that's the exact same soybeans. I planted the beans before we put the fence up. The beans on the outside of that fence are gone. They're gone. They ate every one of them. So it's definitely better than not having a fence, even though there's some. And I told you this when we discussed the IPM. There's none of these things really that are 100%. We're going to have some escapes, just like we do with everything else we do in ag. Can we do it at a way that the damage is tolerable? It's very tolerable with this fence. It's doing a good job. And so was the last one. The offset fence is working fairly well too. The deer buster fence is the most expensive fence that we looked at. It's an 8 foot tall, high tensile woven wire fence. We have 30 foot post spacing. This is the only fence I have tested with 0 deer entry. We haven't had a single deer get into this fence. I've got lots of pictures of them investigating the concept of getting into the fence, but none of them have figured it out. Now, having said that, where the deer aren't going now, the rabbits are. The rabbits are in there eating them just as bad as the deer did. So it doesn't work for rabbits, but it does work for deer. The fishing line fence. This is just something I wanted to play with and see how it worked. I know we've played with it in some other areas at different scales and different sizes. It worked flawlessly in the beginning. We have an 11-strand fence. It's a 100-pound test. The first 3 foot, we have 6-inch spacing. And then after that, we have a foot spacing between the rest of the lines, 8 foot tall total. You can go 30 to 100 foot between posts if you want. We had that same preliminary period. We've had 1,300 deer interactions, but here's the kicker. We've had 840 deer entries into that fence. And if you go out there today, there isn't a leaf left on a soybean. Now we've got stems and we've got pods, but they have finally removed every single soybean leaf from that plot. Once the first doe figured out how to get in that fence, she trained everybody else, I guess, because now that's where everybody goes to meet and get ready for the evening. But in the beginning, it worked flawlessly. Now, having said that, if you look at the picture on the right, that's your control out there where it looks like sand. Well, that was planted in soybeans the exact same day, the exact same pass. I did that, but I planted that field before we built the fence. The beans inside that deer fence that doesn't appear to be working very well are still far superior to what's on the outside of that fence. So it's not easy for me to tell you the fence doesn't work when I have far more beans inside the fence than I do outside the fence. It did work, just not well enough. So we're going to play around with that, see if we can make it work better. So just to wrap all that up, the big key to this whole thing, you got to reduce that deer density. Whether you reduce it through the regular hunting season or a combination of the hunting season plus depredation permits, whatever you have to do, we need to shoot to get that deer population down to around 30 deer per square mile or less. And yeah, I can't overemphasize that. That is the key to making this work so that we can farm and live with deer. We have to get that density down. In my opinion, improving this natural forage that's out there, it can hurt you far more than it can help you. We've seen that in a lot of locations now. Repellents, while some of them are not extremely effective, there are several on the market that work very well. Incorporate those repellents, but they're not full season products. You're going to have to watch it. When you start having damage, put a product back out. And I highly recommend rotating those products. Don't use the same one every time. And I realize we can't afford to fence in every acre we're trying to farm. And I realize we don't have time to check on fencing for every acre that we farm. Trust me, I understand what goes into that. But where it's feasible, fencing provides a good alternative, a good option, if you will, to help reduce that deer damage. And Brian, I don't know if we have any more questions.
Yeah, got one that we haven't addressed yet. Do you have experience with acoustic repellents or combining different methods to reduce the habituation effect?
I have looked at, not in a scientific manner, but I have had some experience with acoustics. I've had some experience with motion sensing devices that trigger. One of the ones I saw last year that was pretty cool. If you've ever been to the car lot, you know they have the guy with the blowing fan. Its arms move like this when you blow air through it. They set one of those up with a motion sensor. There's some stuff going on now with lighting where it flashes lights. They get habituated to that really fast, really fast. You know, I'm not going to tell you not to use it. It's a tool in the toolbox, but it's not effective for very long. They figure that out pretty quick. Use of guard dogs. I seen some folks that did that where they had staked out dogs on the perimeter of the field to keep the deer, and the dogs did their job, and they're on video barking every breath at the deer, and the deer walked right by them into the field and started eating. It's like they know where that run stops at, and they just went around it, went in the field and ate. I think we're going to have to think off the wall ideas like that though if we're ever going to figure it out. So I don't want to sound too pessimistic by saying that none of them have worked and let that discourage you from trying it, because one of the things I found from dealing with repellents is what works on one farm doesn't necessarily work on another farm. And what didn't work on this farm might work on another farm. So I don't want to discourage you from trying it, but so far I haven't seen any of those methods be very successful. All right, I'll back out and let you go, Brian.
Okay, we did have
question.
we did have one more pop up that so with an existing field fence, would it help to have an offset wire as a version of the offset fence, or would it be best just to run two lines of offset wire?
I like the offset fence with more wires. I don't know if any of y'all know Edwin Dargan down in, I guess that's the edge of Darlington County. He's using that offset fence and he's got 3 or 4 wires on each one, and it is working very well. Um, Incorporating more wires is probably not a bad idea as far as the effectiveness goes. I'm seeing pretty good results of that fence he's got up. And I'd also throw in there, this isn't replicated work or anything, it's one farm, but what he's doing there, he also switched from the wire to the poly. So you got a more visible wire, and that may be having some of that influence there to why it's working so well.
Sure. Thank you so much, Cory, for a great presentation. So we're gonna move forward with Brian's presentation now. So Brian is a senior livestock and forages agent in he covers Chester, Fairfield, Kershaw, Lancaster, and Richland counties. And he is going to talk with us about fencing options for excluding wildlife on foraging systems especially. So Brian, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, as I go through this, my focus is really going to be talking about fence construction more so than Cory covered the designs that tend to work well excluding wildlife in his presentation. And so what I'm going to really focus on is construction of those fences. As we go through this, we're going to talk about some mistakes that people make. Most of the pictures I have in here of fences that aren't performing as we expect because of how they were constructed, I got while I was driving down the road and stuck my camera and my phone out the window and took a picture. So if it's your fence that I'm putting up here, I didn't mean it. It's just the one I happened to drive by that said that would make a good picture in my presentation. So I hope no offense is taken, but if I do offend you, I hope it's enough that you'll actually change something in how you're building these. You know, there's several types out there of fencing, things we have to consider. What type of fence am I wanting to build? And in the livestock world, we have everything from board fenced, pipe and panel to woven wire to smooth wire electric. Then we get into the poly wires and things like that on some of our temporary fencing. Longevity is very important. The materials we have today available to us last a long time. This high tensile smooth wire fence, if it's a good quality wire, it's going to outlast 3 sets of posts. And our good post should be lasting us 25 or so years. So the wire is excellent with these high tensile type fences. It's not like the old low carbon wire that your granddaddy used to have that you probably are battling with that's fallen down and rusted to pieces and should have probably been replaced 15 years ago. So it's a different deal with that. Safety is a big deal with some of our livestock species when you start getting into the horse world versus the cattle world versus the goat world. You know, there's things that aren't safe for some of these species that work just fine for others. And we have to keep that in mind. And a lot of that goes down to visibility, strength, and how it and how the animal interacts with that fence. Cost is always something we're going to be paying attention to because this a permanent fence is not an inexpensive proposition, and it does cost. It's a significant capital investment, but again, built properly, you're going to get a lot of years out of it as well. We're going to discuss a little bit of these as we go forward, but fencing mistakes that we commonly see: corner post and brace post spacing being incorrect. The installation not being exactly right, picking the wrong material for the job is another problem that we have. And when we get into these electrified high tensile fences, Improper or poor grounding systems is another cause of problems. And it's, those smooth wire, high tensile fences with no electricity on them is not much of a fence as far as trying to contain your livestock or keep animals out. It's not going to work. So having a good ground system and keeping that fence in good shape is important. We're all cost conscious, but sometimes we have to get it through our head that the most inexpensive way is not always the cheapest in the long run. The biggest thing that I'll say on that is, that big old oak tree is the cheapest post on the place right up until the point that you stop swinging the hammer. After that, it's the most aggravating son of a gun you will have in the whole system. So sometimes the least expensive is not always the cheapest in the long run, and keep that in mind. Corner posts, it's got to be, all of these, when we're talking about permanent wire fences, our end post and our corner post and our brace post systems, those posts need to be in the ground 3.5 foot deep for most of our livestock fences. I'll show you a chart here in a minute. When we talk about deer fences, that's a different ball game. But the brace pieces, which I'm talking in those H brace systems on the fences, that the braces are sometimes called the cross pieces in that brace system. It should be about 2.5 times the height of the fence in order to get the geometry and the physics right, so that you don't end up attempting, you have a tension on that wire that actually jacks that post out of the ground instead of keeps tension on the fence system. Then we get into some of the opinion things on the installation side. Do I dig my post holes or do I drive my post holes? Can I drive post in clay ground versus sand ground? Do I use concrete or do I just tamp the dirt back in them? And there's probably less right or wrong answers there as it is opinion. I am not a big fan of concrete around the posts, mainly because I've seen too many posts break off flush with the ground, and they're the post that my gate has to hang on, and it has to go right back in that exact same spot. I can't move it. So whosever idea it was to put that thing into concrete needs to be there to help me dig all that concrete out of the ground so that I can get the post back in the same place. And there's a lot of things that are done where they put it in the ground and they say, well, that'll be somebody else's problem, and they're right. and we're having to deal with it down the road. So there's a place for all of those things, and a place that you could probably pick out where it's not the right thing to do. So a lot of that's more opinionated, but when we're talking about depth in the ground and size of post needed in the system, that's pretty concrete, and that gets down to some of that material appropriateness as well. Again, in these permanent wire fences, when you make a mistake in the corner, you're messing up the whole fence, because that's the heart of keeping everything on those fences intact, especially in these high tensile fences. Our granddaddies got away with some corners that probably weren't built like I'm going to describe, and the reason they got away with it was that old low carbon wire. Once it stretched, and the tension's off the system, and they counted on a lot of posts in the ground to keep the wire where it's supposed to be. And these high tensile wire systems, that's not what we're doing. We're counting on wire tension, keeping it there. So our tension is always on that system. And if the wire sags a little bit, what do? Well, we go out there to the ratchet and we tighten it back up again. So we got to build those corners to where they can stand up to having that tension on them all the time, versus the way we used to build some fences 50 and 60 years ago. And it surprises me how many folks just don't understand how a brace system works and what we're doing. And how do I know they don't know what it does? Because I've seen the way they build some of the things. And you look at it and you go, what in the world is that doing? But the whole the whole function of this is our end post. This is the end post in our line we're pulling the wire in the direction where that arrow is on number 2. Our whole goal is to keep this end post from moving. That's it. We don't want it to budge. So we utilize this cross member and this brace post to transfer some of the load from this post over to this post and hold this whole system together so the top end of this post doesn't move. And this brace wire is important, and its whole job is to stop the top of this brace post from being moved by the tension. This angle is very important. We want that angle to be 30 degrees or less. So that's why the length of this cross member is very important, because if we get that angle out of that realm, that's when we start changing the physics and we end up jacking the post out of the ground. And I've got a picture of that we'll look at here in just a minute. But that's kind of how an old H-brace corner works. The other thing that's going to help us keep this thing from moving is getting the post, again, picking the right size post. And for these end posts and these brace posts, we're needing a 6 to 8 inch post in most of our cases. A 4-inch post really is not going to cut it in a lot of cases. So 8 inch, those 7-8 posts is or 7-8 inch post are what we need to be buying for these end posts and this brace post. Cory talked about the 8-foot deer fence. When we go building those, all of a sudden, we're talking about a cross member piece that's going to need to be 20 feet long and a post that's going to need to be about 14 or 15 foot long to go in the ground in order to hold that system in place. And Cory had some pictures up there of fixed knot, high tensile woven wire fences with just a post in the ground. And it wasn't a telephone pole size post. So the longevity of that system when we do that, to me, is in jeopardy. So we got to build these end posts right. And when folks, and yeah, go price some of that material that I've got up here. And you'll quickly figure out that, maybe the wire isn't the most expensive thing that I have to deal with in this thing. Those posts get expensive when you start getting them that size. And that's why we see a lot of those fences built with metal components rather than wood, because at some point those become less expensive and the longevity of those are better for us. So the alternative to that single brace, the single cross member, is to go back to what we call the double H brace system. Then you don't need as long of a cross member post to get the same load bearing that the fence has. But it ends up throwing 2 more posts into the mix on every corner that you make. So sometimes those long cross pieces pencil out from an economic standpoint versus 2 more posts to put in the system, having a double brace post and a double cross member in every corner. So again, I spend a lot of time talking about corner posts and way to build them, because that is absolutely the heart of this of the longevity on these permanent type wire fences. Here's an example that bundles a bunch of mistakes into one thing. Here's an H corner, and what's the 2 things that we did wrong here? Well, our corner and brace posts are too small. Those are 4-inch posts, and that cross member is too short. And you can see what it's doing between the post being too small and that cross member being too short. It is literally jacking that post right out of the ground, and that's going to put slack in the system and cause us problems down the road. So got to keep that in mind. And we talked about posts being 3 foot, 3.5 foot in the ground. And this is also like I said, I get a lot of these pictures going down the road, but as a scale, that's about 5.5 foot out of the ground right there. So what's the first thing popped in my mind when I saw that? How long is that post? Is that a 10-foot long post that we've got almost 4 feet in the ground? Or is that an 8 foot, is that an 8 foot post that we don't have in the ground hardly enough? So what's that? What do I have here? And so that's the question when that pops up, because you can see what this one looks like, and that's kind of your regular old 8 foot post that we put 3.5 to 4 feet in the ground. You know, that's kind of the height. And then you got these big boys here. I hope that's a 10 foot long post. If not, we got problems. But again, that brace post and end post sizes, 6-inch diameter minimum, and get them in the ground at least 3.5 feet. And that will help get these corners built. And yes, when the first time you build an H brace with a 10-foot cross piece, you're going to think, good Lord, that is the funkiest looking thing that I've ever seen in my life. It's stretched out and it's different. But you know, this is a picture of a well-constructed H brace system that's using this new technology, the fixed knot high tensile woven wire fence. Again, this H brace system is going to be able to take that tension that wire is going to constantly have on that brace. So take some time and build your end post and your corners right. In order to, because it'll pay off in the long run. You know, an alternative to that is a dead man post. It's a fairly large end post without the H brace. Put 4 feet in the ground, but we basically dig a trench right on the side of the post that's in the direction of the pull. Put a 4 foot piece of post right up against the other one and bury it in the ground. And that's going to help us keep that post from moving. This is a really good system on interior fences that only have 1 or 2 or maybe 3 strands on them. And the pull on that system is not as hard as if we have 8 strands or an 8-strand woven wire, high tensile, or putting 5 strands of high tensile on it. It's definitely an alternative that does work if it's built correctly. There's extra work involved here because we got to dig a trench and put that 4 foot dead man in there and bury it back. But this system will work. But especially I think it works good on some interior fences, or some places where we're going to have temporary fence up and take it down, and having that in, we don't have an H brace that we're having to dodge and go around. We just have a single post that we have to work around. A little bit on the longevity of materials. Yes, you can go out to your place and cut down some red cedars and square them up, put them in the ground as fence posts. They work well. They're untreated. That lifespan's about 15 to 20 years. You know, you go to the store and buy that treated southern pine, you know, you're going to get about 5 more years out of that southern pine post than you will that untreated red cedar. And yes, there is a lot of folks that do this. It does work, but it does not quite have the longevity of some of our store-bought treated post. You know, locust is as a good a natural tree for a post as you can find. You might have to take a drill pilot holes to get your fence staples in it, but it will last as long as that treated pine will, if you have enough of those around. So keep that in mind when you're picking your material out. Sometimes, again, the least expensive thing is not the cheapest in the long run. Touch base a little bit, shifting gears to some of our electrified fences, and I think this is also going to be important when we're talking about these systems that Cory mentioned. That grounding system and grounding that fence is almost as crucial as building the corner posts as far as making that fence work correctly. If we don't have adequate grounding, the electrical pulse is not going to complete its circuit. And if electricity can't complete a circuit, then it's not going to work like it's supposed to. And if we only put one ground rod in the ground, this is really only going to be adequate if that area is fairly wet ground that stays fairly wet 365 days a year. So we have to keep that in mind because we got to have enough moisture to get that current to flow. And again, this is essential when putting that fence in. Your energizer plays a role in this, absolutely. But more capacity on the energizer cannot overcome a poor ground system. It can do it on a short fence or a fence that doesn't cover a great distance, but on longer fences, trying to compensate for poor grounding with a bigger energizer is not going to really get the job done to suit us either. We do have to size that energizer properly for the amount of fence that we're trying to cover and get the right size there. But it's not going to overcome an inadequate ground. Conductivity of the soil is also very important. Generally speaking, in South Carolina, we have enough moisture 99% of the time for these electric fences to work as they should. We'll show a system here in a minute that tries to help compensate for those arid environments where the ground doesn't do a good job of conducting. And think about the type of livestock or the predators you're looking to try to keep out. Small ruminants are notorious for not getting shocked by an electric fence versus cattle. So we have to keep that in mind and keep that construction correct for the species. Yeah, a lot of folks don't realize that the way that animal gets shocked when they touch that fence is that charge has to go all the way back to the ground system at the energizer. And if this cow is 2 miles away from this, yes, it has to go 2 miles through the dirt in order for it to work. So that's why that we're saying a proper ground system is extremely important, and why we do have some arid environments in the country and in the world that this system won't work that well because of that. And when I'm talking a proper ground system, this is kind of what I'm talking about. 3 6-foot ground rods in the ground, approximately 10 feet or more apart, tied together. And that's going to give us the proper ground that we need. And when folks have a problem with the fence charger not putting out appropriate amount of volts onto the fence, and we've checked the fence and there's nothing there grounding it out, my solution is generally put another ground rod in the ground and see what happens. And a lot of times that fixes the problem. And a lot of folks in some places say, well, I can't get a darn rod in the ground 6 foot. I'll run into rock. You know what? This rod don't care if it's in the ground straight up and down or sideways. Dig to the rock and lay them in the ground sideways and cover them with dirt and tie them together underground. It'll still work. We drive them deep to chase moisture. And if you can't drive them deep, then just, lay them horizontal and it works just fine. The alternative is to have a ground wire in the fence system. In other words, we have one wire that's hot and one wire that is tied back into the ground, and we may have another wire that is hot if we got a 3-wire system. The theory here is the animal touches both the live wire and this ground wire, and now all of a sudden that charge doesn't have to go back through the ground to get to the grounding system. It can go back through that wire, and it'll still shock them by doing it that way. So this is the system that oftentimes we suggest folks use with small ruminants. And it's also what we suggest to use in those arid environments where the ground does get too dry. It's not, and you can, again, and I have seen this tied together with a ground system somewhere other than the energizer as well. So basically you've increased the ground there when you put 3 stakes in at the energizer, and then on the other end of the fence, you do the same thing. Well, we've got an outstanding ground system when we do that. This is the slanted wire that Cory talked about. And again, just to kind of illustrate this, and we were talking about deer all day today, but in forage situations and in our hay fields, we get as much hog damage as we do from anything else, and this type of fence with some power on it can help us keep hogs out of these areas as well, and it'll serve two purposes. And some electric fence with the with low wires can do a good job of trying to exclude some hog damage from these forage areas, especially. And we had some of our trial plots last year with our winter annuals that base got wiped out by deer pressure. So this is becoming to be an issue. We used to think it was always the row crop guys that had to deal with it, but it's becoming an issue with some of our winter annual plantings, especially. And again, Cory showed this picture, but this is we're building the same type of H-brace system on these slanted wire systems as we're doing in the traditional wires. So got to be the same. We're just being creative on how we keep the stagger on that wire system so that it does constantly have that lean by making these stay wires different lengths as we come around this corner. And we're actually putting that corner system, instead of being in line with the wire, we're putting it perpendicular to the wire, accomplishing the same thing. I'm going to talk a little bit about temporary fencing here now. This is when we're getting to our lighter weight stuff: polywire, polytape, flexible netting. Not something that we're going to use with wildlife exclusion too much, except it does work. It does work for some of our predators and our poultry, but for what we're talking about here today, not so much. There is lighter weight wire that can work in a temporary system. This wire is more the heavy wire, but there is lighter weight stuff that can be taken up and removed, and it's still a traditional wire, but it's a little bit thinner gauge, smaller gauge, and a little bit easier to work with. Too many times folks try to plug this wire into a permanent system that they want to last for 30 years, and that doesn't work. That's when we need to get into the good wire that's going to be a little more expensive, but it's going to last us. The polywire and polytape are great. They're easy to put up, easy to take down. We can put them on reels and take them up and put them out very easily. And they do work well with temporary tread-in type posts where we don't have to put up something permanent to make them work. Here's an example of what I'm talking about with the posts, and that poly wire is just like it says. It's a fiberglass component wire that's got actually small strands of wire woven in with it. I think it hurts worse to get shocked by this than it does smooth wire. I mean, that's just my opinion, but it smarts if it's got a good charger on it. And it works very well. It is pretty visible. It's more visible than the metal wire. It's easily tightened. It's easy to splice it together. If you know how to tie a square knot, you can fix a break, and it'll keep the conductivity very well. And it can be reused multiple times if it's put up correctly. Sunlight will degrade this stuff over time, so we do have to watch that, and it will get brittle on us, but it can be used for multiple seasons. Poly tape provides the best visibility. It's just a wide, flat piece of tape. Same concept as the poly wire, same material as the poly wire. But it is more visible and easy to see. And these temporary posts work great with this poly tape and poly wire. These posts usually have some type of hook on them to let you be able to space the wires out as you desire. And these work great with some of the offset two-tiered fence systems that we're talking about, especially when you may not want something up permanently, or if you got a real valuable crop, like a produce crop that you just want to protect, and you might plant the produce in a different place next year. You can take this up and move it as your crop rotation moves around. and it's very easy with the reels to be able to do that. And this is kind of a two-tier system built like that. This one is put in a more permanent post in this and used a fiberglass. That looks like about a 7/8 fiberglass post. Those are really good for ends. They're stiff enough that you can put some tension on that system and hold it. Flexible enough that if something hits it, it's got some give to it. If you hit it hard enough, it will break. So it's that rigid. It's not like those other tread-in posts like we had in the other picture that have a lot of flex to them, and you could and really won't take a whole lot of tension, but they do work to help space those wires out. And this system is using a battery charger. They have solar chargers out here, so you don't have to worry about constantly taking a battery back and forth to the charger and keeping it on full charge. And those chargers work well. Again, a lot of time on these temporary systems, we're only putting one ground rod in the ground for convenience. To me, it's check that fence and make sure that it has the right voltage on it. If you don't have 3,000 volts or more on this fence, it's not going to work real good. Animals can tolerate that and walk through it. So we need to get that voltage up. And if you want to see what your efficiency is, put your fence tester right on the terminal on the charger with it hooked to the ground system, but not hooked to the hot wire. Put your reader right on that hot terminal and see what that reads, and then hook your fence into it and see what the fence reads. I've got a lot of chargers at my place that when I read them with the fence unhooked, they're at 8,000, 9,000 volts. I hook the fence to it. They're at 7,000, 8,000 volts. That's pretty efficient. When it drops down to 5,000 volts, we've got some grounding issues, or we got some stuff on the fence that is bleeding off. So now 5,000 volts will still stop your critters, but know that you're losing some efficiency in that system. And that's where I say, a bigger charger can overcome some things, but at a point, it becomes cost prohibitive because those big chargers get into $400, $500 pretty easily. Where if you build your ground system right, you can get by with one that's a couple of $100 for the amount of fence that you have. So again, keep those in mind. And this fence, of course, is around a produce crop, pretty high value crop. So they're very interested in keeping the deer out of it. Probably more so to protect that plastic than it is to protect the crop in a lot of places, because they want to use that plastic for the next crop too. And if the deer have stomped all in it, stomped holes in it, well, the integrity of keeping the weeds out is gone. So different goals. And again, we showed the system that had, the one wire on the deer side and the two wires on the crop side. But I think Cory covered it. It's more the depth perception issue that deer have. And when we put up multiple layers of fence staggered like that, it confuses them, and it looks like something that they can't jump over. They can't make that length of jump. It's kind of like the reason that cattle guards work with cattle. They look at that space in those in between those things in your cattle guard, and that cow's poor depth perception makes that thing look like the Grand Canyon, and they just don't try it. And I think that's kind of what we're dealing with the deer, is we're getting this depth perception to where we're fooling them. Could a deer with a running start clear those two fences? I think absolutely they could, but they're looking at it and they're going, nope, I don't think I'm gonna try that. And now if something chases them, I don't care what it is, I probably just go through it. But if they're coming up and investigating, that depth fools them, and it's the same thing that kind of works like a cattle guard works with cattle. So there's different ways of doing this, and different ways of constructing it. But I think, like I say, this offset part is the thing that's going to get you. And we had folks, and I've had folks that built this system, and the whole time they were building it to try to keep the deer out of their sunflowers or whatever it was they're wanting to protect, they were absolutely, while they're building it, they're going, this is worthless. There ain't no way this is going to work. The deer are going to get in there and they're going to eat my stuff up just like they did last year. And they built it, and they come back to you and they say, that dadgum thing worked. And I don't know how, but it worked. And so it is a system that we can use that does work for us. And as far as the cost goes, this is fairly minimal. And quite frankly, I'll probably try this first before you put up something permanent. That way, you got things where you want it. And it's a whole lot easier to move when you have it built like this versus when you've sunk 6-inch posts 3.5 foot in the ground at every corner. So try it with the temporary stuff first, and see that you like it and see that you have it where you want it. And if you're satisfied with it, then we can come back and maybe do some permanent construction to protect some of these things that we're looking to protect. All right, that's all I have.
Thank you, Brian. We have one more like a comment here on the chat. So with these electric fences, you need open ground on the approach to the fence. You can put the fence up against a brush or woods like. They will blunder into it and damage the fence. If you want to mention anything about.
Yeah, I can hit that real quick. I agree wholeheartedly. On these deer fences, and it may be different with pigs, but I assume it's going to be the same. You really need a truck width or more from the wood line out into the field before you start that fence. You don't want it flush against the trees, because if you do, they'll just blow through it. You got to get a little bit of space out there. Give them time to think. They'll confuse themselves enough that they'll turn around and try something else. So give them a little space. Bob's right about that.
And also, when you have like the forage or any weed touching the polytape, you're gonna be losing power. So definitely, like the pictures that Brian was showing, they are really clean on that area. That's important as well.
Yeah, and a lot of times we're talking about electrifying these fences. The closer I get them to brush and woods, it may be fine this year, but in 2 years, that stuff is going to be grown into my fence unless I am over there keeping it cut out of it. And that's a place where it's going to bleed off, and you're going to lose voltage, and you might lose the effectiveness of the fence as well. So at least having it spaced up enough to where we can keep things clear, because that's the biggest thing. Stuff grows around that electrified fence. I've got some on my place that was put up 30 years ago, and some stuff has grown up in it. And if it's a heavy dew in the morning, I don't have the voltage on that fence that I do after that. Everything dries off. I've got drains on it. So yes, all that can affect it. Absolutely.
All right. So does anybody have any questions? What is quiet? Oh, I don't see any other questions on the chat. So both Cory and Brian shared their contacts. If you have any questions later on, you are welcome to just contact them. I'm going to take a minute to thank you both again. This was really a great webinar, and we were able to touch bases on a lot of points that are going to be really important for everybody planting cool season forages, either annual or managing the perennials for the upcoming season. So thank you so much for all the content that you both shared today.